know you did. So did the world. Don't you know it went viral?
Yeah, just avoid these two. 15 seconds.
Don't let them tell you what to do. You take them out like a grown adult.
10, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold for open. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, good evening and welcome to the 11th Congressional District Debate here at our very own Basin PBS and NewsWest Family Studio in downtown Midland. I'm John Trischetti, board member of Basin PBS. On behalf of the board, I would like to welcome you to tonight's 11th Congressional District Debate. We have been honored here in West Texas with both the Odessa mayoral debate, MISD school board debate. Tonight's debate is an accumulation of our mission to educate and inform before early voting begins. We would like to thank all three candidates for participating and our moderators. I would be remiss if I did not mention the incredible staff at Basin PBS and thank them for all of their hard work getting ready for tonight. Tonight's moderators are Pat Canty, former Basin PBS board publisher and board member and publisher of the Odessa American, and Tatum Gwynn, anchor for NewsWest 9. We'd also like to thank NewsWest 9 for their ongoing partnership with Basin PBS. In addition to viewers' questions, we are pleased to have representatives from all three school districts. If you have a question for the candidates you want to post on Basin PBS's Facebook page, we will do our best to include your questions in tonight's debate. Also, this evening we have a small studio audience, socially distanced, of course. It is now my pleasure to turn over tonight's debate to our moderators, Pat Canty and Tatum Wood.
Thank you very much, John. Welcome tonight. We're so glad you made it. Joining me at the moderator's desk and co-moderators for this debate is NewsWest 9 anchor Tatum Gwynn. Glad to have you, Tatum. Now, tonight's debate will be 90 minutes with one 2-minute break. As John mentioned, if you have a question that you would like to have the candidates answer, please post them to our Basin PBS Facebook page, and we'll do our best to get it answered. We'll begin tonight's debate by giving each candidate, in alphabetical order, 2 minutes for opening remarks. After these opening remarks, the moderators should pose a series of general questions. Now, each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to each question. In the event a candidate's answer to a question invokes the name or policy position of one or more opponents, the moderators, at our sole discretion, can give the referenced opponent 30 seconds to respond. It is important to note an individual candidate may also be asked a direct question because of the statement or policy position that he has made during the campaign. In that case, the candidate will also have a second rebuttal rule applying there as well. At the conclusion of tonight's questions, each candidate will have 1 minute for closing statements. Now, we remind our in-studio audience that this is a live broadcast, so flash photography or booing or making loud noises or other disruptive actions or comments are not allowed. Now, let's meet our three candidates for the 11th Congressional District. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming Mr. Wacey Alpha Cody, Mr. Mark Hogg, John Mark Hogg,
Hello.
And Mr. August Pfluger.
Good evening.
Welcome, candidates. Mr. Cody, we'll begin with your opening remarks.
Awesome. 2 minutes is a long time before they ask you to talk about yourself. First things first, all of you high school students here, never let anyone set limitations on you except yourself. All my life, I've heard that to run for office you have to be rich or a lawyer. And I'm standing here today, one of 3 people, and I prove by being here that you don't have to be that. I am here with less than $5,000 raised, and I think that speaks to how remarkable this nation is. Secondly, you're going to hear 2 different philosophies tonight. One is free market. One is you should have the right to govern your own life. and the other is about government control. It's just, do you want this side controlling your life or this side? Because at this point, you have a free market individual, a socialist, and a communist at my right. And if there's disagreement above that, I understand that point. But at the end of the day, I want you to be able to live your life as you see fit, not as government sees fit. I want to live my life as I see fit. That's it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hogg, your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Laura Wolf and Basin PBS for hosting this, and I also want to thank my opponents, Mr. Cody and Mr. Pfluger, for agreeing to be here tonight. I think this is a very important time. I would be remiss if I didn't also thank my wife Claire, without whose support this would not be possible. For those of you who do not know me, I live in San Angelo, Texas, and have lived there since 1992. My father was a minister, my parents were Baptist missionaries, and so we grew up all over the place. Ended up in El Paso, Texas, where I attended junior high and high school, then went on to college at Baylor, graduated law school from St. Mary's Law School in San Antonio. In 1992, we moved back to what was my wife's hometown of San Angelo, and we've been there ever since. I practiced law. I've also served on the city council, and I practiced my law all over the district in all 29 counties of this district. I've represented governments, I've represented businesses, I've represented individuals, and I understand in my service through the city council, I understand government and I understand how government works. I'm the only candidate in this race who has actual experience serving as an elected official. I'm the only candidate who has actually worked at procuring jobs and doing economic development for the community in District 11. I'm the only candidate who has actually served and represented the interests of oil and gas and agriculture and industry across this district over the last 28 years. This is my home. This is where I want to be. This is where I have been for the last 28 years. I ask for your vote, and I look forward to a lively discussion of debate and issues and the competition of ideas here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger, your remarks.
Pat, Tatum, Basin PBS, thank you for having us, and I'd like to also thank my opponents for your willingness and your courage to be a part of this process tonight and throughout this campaign. Good evening, my name is August Pfluger, and I'd like to define that in 21 days, we are facing a way of life fight. This country, right now, is facing a decision. And we haven't faced a decision like this probably since World War II. And on one hand, we're facing a decision that folks would want to destroy and degrade and defund. And on another hand, we're facing a decision where the Republican Party wants to renew and rebuild and restore this country, to continue to build an economy that is strong, to care for our national security, to make sure that we do everything possible for our oil and gas industry that has fueled not only the state of Texas, but also this country, that has gotten itself to a position of energy independence where we can now say that we export more than we import. And when it comes to agriculture, in these 29 counties of one of the greatest districts, if not the greatest district in this country, we are a top 10 producer in beef and a top 10 producer in cotton. And when you look at the things that we're doing right here in District 11, they fall underneath the national security umbrella. We are keeping the country safe by fueling and feeding our citizens. And that's under attack. And we're going to have to make a decision, and I would just implore every single one of you that starting tomorrow on the 13th, go out and vote. Exercise your right to vote, to have your voice be heard, because right now the silent majority is overshadowed by what we see in the messages of media that would let you think that a loud minority of folks is controlling this country, and that is just not true. My name is August Pfluger. I would be honored to have your vote to serve you as your congressman in District 11.
Thank you. Okay, let's get going with tonight's debate. Question number one. You know, in West Texas, District 11, oil and gas, it reigns supreme, and we have made efforts to diversify what our economy is known for, one of those being exploring the possibility of storing nuclear waste, specifically high-level nuclear waste. So my question to you three, are you for or against the cross-country transport of America's entire inventory of high-level nuclear waste for storage at the surface for an undetermined period of time at 2 sites within the Permian Basin? Mr. Cody, we'll start with you.
It's pretty simple. Public or private? If it's publicly funded and it's public, like a public service, no. Because I don't want a guy in Kansas regulating what is safe and not safe here in District 11. I don't want it to be federally governed. If it's privately funded, I want oversight from local engineers, local architects that make sure that is a safe facility for all of us. Is it possible to eradicate all potential problems on any case? And the answer is no, absolutely not. However, you can never, I was raised, you cannot live life in fear, and you cannot let fear keep you from making a dollar, and that's it.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg?
I've been talking about this issue since last fall, and my position is clear and has been stated before. I'm opposed to any plan to waste to West Texas for storage, temporary or otherwise, especially under the circumstances that we find ourselves in now, because there is no permanent plan for any sort of permanent deep underground storage. We're talking about above ground storage with minimal security. We're talking about risk to the community, not just to this district, but to Dallas-Fort Worth, to Houston, San Antonio, and other cities along the rail lines where this would be transported over years. So I'm definitely opposed to that. I think there are other alternatives that we should be looking at, and we should be going back to the drawing board, coming up with a national policy approach of how we address our highly radioactive waste. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger?
Tatum, thanks for the question. I think it's important to note that we did have a national plan for this, and that plan included storing nuclear waste, including high-level nuclear waste, at Yucca Mountain. And in 2010, 2011, that plan was killed by Senator Harry Reid of Nevada. And so when we look at this, the problem that we find ourselves in right now has been manifested because of a failure of government to make a decision that was suitable, that was safe, that cared for the constituency, not just of our district or another district, but of the entire United States. I'm against high-level nuclear waste coming to the Permian Basin. I've had many conversations with PBPA, with many industry leaders, and look at this as, again, a failure previously to define a safe place that wouldn't involve our resources and our safety.
Thank you.
So West Texas has always been kind of the energy epicenter, especially in the area of oil and gas. But obviously in the recent year or so, between the price of oil and the pandemic, the oil and gas industry has really suffered. So what can you do to help West Texas kind of reemerge as kind of an oil and gas powerhouse? We'll start with you, Mr. Hogg.
Thank you very much. The key part, the problem that we have is we have had in our country, we have not had a national policy related to sustaining and maintaining high enough oil prices across the years. President Trump's administration has had a policy for years of keeping prices low and urging the Saudis to bring prices down for years and years. Only at the time of the pandemic does he all of a sudden, after there's tremendous industry pressure put upon him, come around to the idea of trying to do what we can to prop up energy resources. There's a short term and a long term of that. The short term, of course, is increased demand. We're only going to be able to do that unless we attack the COVID pandemic in a serious way and we get our people back to work. That's how we bring up the price of oil in the short term. In the long term, we have to look at a national policy and engaging in the global markets and making a major play for that.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger, your response.
Pat, thanks for the question. This is so important for this area, for our country, and for our national security. First off, I don't think that government has any business in setting the price of oil. And what our campaign has been doing since March 9th, when the Permian Basin has gotten into one of the worst crashes in history, where we have seen negative oil, I have personally arranged many phone calls with the administration, letting independent producers right here in the Permian Basin voice their concerns to the administration on how we can continue to create a level playing field. And it's a structure. For instance, when the Saudis did dump millions of unnecessary barrels onto the market, and the Russians as well, we urged the president to make those calls and to let them know that that was economic warfare. The result was that they cut that production back to market forces, and we got ourselves into a better free market structure. But this is so important. This is one of the most critical areas of national security, to continue to allow the Permian Basin to innovate and to produce 40% of the country's oil.
Thank you. And Mr. Cody, your response.
He wants to implement policy to regulate oil. He wants to implement policy to regulate oil. That is government control. That is government control. Mr. Pfluger actually just stated he wanted better free market. You can't better free market. You either have a free market and the processes of supply and demand dictate the price of any good, or you artificially create a floor and elevate the price. You both said the same thing, in my humble opinion, about having government control in industry. That's it.
Okay. I believe you invoked both of your names or positions. Would either of you choose for a 30-second response?
Absolutely.
Mr. Pfluger, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, and when we talk about the free market and we talk about folks around the country and around the world that are doing things that are market inefficiencies, what we're really talking about is economic warfare on this country. And that's what happened in the case of Saudi and Russia dumping unnecessary barrels onto the market. And so we're going to protect this industry by making sure that there is a level playing field, and that's exactly what was done, because they were not acting in the way that a partner or an ally would act.
Time. Okay, Mr. Hogg, would you care to have 30 seconds?
Yes.
Okay.
The key issue is a decision that the oil and gas industry is going to have to make, is whether do we want to continue to be a net exporter of oil and gas in the world market, or do we want to just go back to a domestic market as we've had before. There is no issue. The oil and gas market, and anyone in the industry who's honest will tell you, is not a free market. 90% of the proven reserves are controlled by state-run companies such as Aramco. We have to be involved, and we have to have national direction to speak for our country in that area.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we have the great opportunity to hear from one of our students from Lee High School. Here's Wyatt David.
What do you plan on doing to help better the education system in District 11 as a whole?
Mr. Pfluger, we'll start with you on that question.
Well, Wyatt, thank you for taking part in this process. I think it's so important that we have a policy, not just a policy, but participation, and I appreciate your question. And I'll start by saying that education really is a state issue, and it's something that's so important for our state and local control. The folks at the Midland School Board and the Odessa School Board and San Angelo and Granbury, and parents need to have the say on what their children are learning, what schools they go to, and how they're going to be educated. And so I think when it comes to the issue of education, I would offer that we don't want education being dictated from Washington, D.C. We want that to happen in Midland and Odessa at this local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Cody?
I absolutely agree with Mr. Pfluger on this. It is in no way the federal government's jurisdiction to control or manage education in this nation. I will probably go a step further and say that it's local control. I mean, it's your child that is going to school in that community. Why would we put somebody's voice in Houston over a parent's voice in District 11? Secondly, our education system mirrors the society that we lived in 1950. Suburbia household, single parent income. You get home, you do your homework with a mom or dad that stayed at home. Our society no longer exists in the same anxiety our current education system was created in. Most parents, you have two working parents in a household with children that then get home. We have to really evaluate the entire education system as a whole.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg?
We have to let teachers teach, and we have to properly fund our public school system. Right now, there is a process in this country, and I totally agree that it is a state and local issue, but the federal government is attempting to do an end run around the decisions that were made by our representatives in Austin related to school choice and charter schools and vouchers. There's a federal bill introduced by Ted Cruz trying to do an end run around that issue because the voters of Texas have already decided and they don't like that result. That's the issue that Betsy DeVos has continued to do and punched in with the Department of Education and funneling millions of dollars of grant funding to charter schools, corporate charter schools that are spending money on Super Bowl tickets and box seats and Lear jets. Those are not the things that we should be spending on. We can barely afford, apparently, to fund one school system. How in the world are we going to fund 2 or 3?
So obviously oil and gas is king out here, but it also shows kind of the folly of if we have all our eggs in one basket and oil and gas goes south, our economies really take a hit. What kind of thoughts or ideas do each of you have on ways that our economies can be diversified here? We'll start with you, Mr. Cody.
As a federal candidate, I don't believe my position should be micromanaging any district. I believe in entrepreneurship. I believe in every person's ability to work and achieve their best outcome, whatever the given day is. And you look across the board historically and even in this nation, when government interferes with entrepreneurship, it causes more problems than it ever causes gains. So I guess to answer your question, federally, I'm going to do nothing.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Hogg, your response.
Yes, I think my hometown of San Angelo is a good example of this because we've been through this since we first moved there. San Angelo used to be as heavily dependent, if not maybe more so, than Midland and Odessa. Since the last boom, before this last bust, it had made a conscious effort to diversify its economy. And a lot of that focus was related to high-tech and high-paying jobs is what we focused on. We focused on bringing in production, we focused on bringing in manufacture and service industries, but all focused related to the high-tech, which is the direction that we need to be going. In the Midland-Odessa area and in the Permian Basin in particular, I think renewable energy and the technology that's driving that is a key that fits right in with the energy-based economy that we have, and I think we can be, the Permian Basin should be the nation's leader in setting policy on technology-driven innovation for renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Pfluger, your response.
Yeah, Pat, thank you for this question. It's so critical. And I'm going to go back to the fact that in the Permian Basin, we're producing 40% of the country's oil. And that's so critical, not just for the economy of District 11 or the state of Texas, but for the economy of the United States. It's almost 10% of our GDP. And so when it comes to diversification, there's a number of things that we're already doing, including agriculture, like I've already talked about, throughout this district. And those things both lead towards a more secure and a more stable district, state, and country. The most important instrument of power that we have in the United States is our economy, the #1 GDP in the world. And we need to make sure that we allow that innovation to happen. We don't need federal mandates coming down to this district telling people how to do their business, what kind of business they need to be doing. We need that innovation to be unleashed. And I'm sure that we're going to talk about it with other questions, but it's so critical that we allow the innovative spirit to happen. That's the spirit of all Texans.
Okay, well, while we are talking about energy, and one topic that certainly seems to get people fired up out here is fracking. You know, when you go outside of West Texas, people don't fully understand what it is, how it works. How would you represent fracking as a benefit on the national level? And would you stand up for any measures taken against fracking? Mr. Hogg, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I would not take any measures against fracking. Fracking is essential to the economy. It's essential to powering not just our economy, but the world. Natural gas is the cleanest form of energy in sufficient quantities that we have to power the greatest economy in the world. We have to continue that. We also have to continue that with innovation, with technology, making it cleaner, making it better, and addressing those things. But fracking is a key part of it. Eventually, oil and gas is a finite resource. We don't know how much longer that will last. It may be another 100 years, it may be another 200 years. But there's going to be a glide away from that, and I think what we need is natural gas to give us that transition period, to buy us the time so that we can glide forward into the future on what our future energy needs and resources will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger?
Yep. Thank you very much for the question, Tatum. So important what fracking has done in the shale revolution. Over the last 10 years, 70% of the country's growth in oil has occurred right here in the Permian Basin. That has gotten us to the energy independence that we're talking about. That has allowed the president to have a lever, an instrument of power to do what we need geopolitically around the world. Make no mistake about it, the Democrats will ban fracking. And they have said repeatedly that they will. The co-sponsor for the Green New Deal is none other than the vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris. So yes, I will stand up for it. It is absolutely critical to make sure that we continue to provide inexpensive energy, not just for the state, but also for the country and the world. We have never experienced a higher quality of life around the world. We have brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty because of the inexpensive energy. And largely, that is a result of what the innovative ideas and technology in the Permian Basin are doing.
Mr. Hogg, would you like a 30-second response to Mr. Pfluger's statement about Democrats banning fracking?
I would love to. That is not the case. The president has said it, and there is no issue, there is no development for renewable resources without fracking, without the ability to produce the natural gas that we have in our country today that feeds us in a way that no energy source before that has ever done. Energy is always in a state of transition. What the president is talking about and the direction for the Democratic Party is we need to be looking forward and moving towards that transition, whereas my Republican opponents and friends would like to look to the back, to go back to the past, which is never coming back.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cody.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, so outside of West Texas, people don't necessarily understand what fracking is, why it's beneficial, why it's important to our region. How would you represent fracking as a benefit on the national level, and would you stand up for any measures taken against fracking?
So, again, federal level, we're discussing people outside of this district enforcing their will upon the citizens of this district. If we want to frack here, it's none of the federal government's jurisdiction to tell us what we can and cannot do in a free market economy. And I call bull on you standing up to Pelosi, by the way.
I guess.
All right, great. Is that it?
Yeah, that does it.
Okay, cool. We'll move on.
Okay, and now we have the opportunity to hear from one of our students from Permian High School, Sneha Kesavan. Sneha?
Thank you. In the midst of the tragedy of last year and an active shooter scare at my own school, what would you do to protect Texans from gun violence and its repercussions?
Thank you, Sneha. We'll throw the question first to you, Mr. Pfluger.
Shania, thank you for the question, and our hearts go out to the victims of a horrific tragedy, a crime that was committed senselessly, without regard to the law. It's one of those things with my daughter's currently in this studio right now that I want to make sure that they're safe, just like every other parent and every other family throughout this district and throughout our country. And I think that the issue that we're facing right now is that there are those who would take our Second Amendment rights away. When we know that the active shooter in Midland, Odessa on Labor Day weekend of 2019 actually broke the law, purchased weapons illegally, and that the seller of those weapons did not have the appropriate license. We're a country of laws. Law and order must reign. We have the appropriate mechanisms in place without infringing upon our liberties. And so I defend the Second Amendment staunchly while making sure that our schools are safer and letting the school boards in the state of Texas define those parameters.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cody, your response.
So I might have a unique look on this compared to both of them because my high school generation was like the first ones that had shelter-in-place laws. And my thought was, you just told everybody where we're going to line up that's going to bring a gun into the school and shoot us in the back through a wall. That's probably 3/4 inch plywood. That might stop a .22. It's not going to stop anything bigger than that. First things, you cannot allow one tragedy to demonize an entire population. Two, as Mr. Pfluger did say, criminals break the law. That's the definition of criminal. And finally, if you're wanting to stop school violence, quit designing schools that are designed to funnel people into hallways and allow for a shooting gallery to happen. Look at the way we design malls. Look at the way we design any public building and create natural lines of sight breaks.
Time. Thank you. Mr. Hogg, your response.
Thank you. We have to address this as a much larger issue. The issue is not about guns and the Second Amendment at this point. The question that was specifically asked is relate to what can we do to ensure the safety of our children in our schools. And this is of primary importance. And it is not just an issue related to schools, as we saw in the Odessa shooting. It is now mobile shooters. There's a pervasive problem across the country that addresses mass violence and the casual gun culture that we have created. I believe in the Second Amendment. I'm not going to give up my guns, and I don't expect anyone else to either. But we have to address the problems. Guns may not be the cause of the problem, but guns are definitely a component of the issue and have to be at the table when we talk about these measures, including background checks, things of that nature, to have some reasonable gun sense laws. And the reason the law was broken was because it was not actually broken, because the issue was that dealer, there was an exemption in the law that has been since a bill been filed to have that done, but the Senate and the President of the United States will not sign it. Thank you.
Well, let's expand on that a moment. You know, August 31st, 2019 is still very fresh on the hearts and minds of all of us here in West Texas. And in just the last week, we learned, or I guess perhaps taking the first steps towards justice, if there is even justice for those 7 families, all the families involved. The man, the person that sold the gun to the gunman should have never had the gun. We understand the situation better now. Mm-hmm. What do you think the solution is to try to prevent a tragedy like that from happening in another community? I know it's such a complex issue. People feel very passionately about it. What would you do? How would you further that conversation? We'll start with you, Mr. Cody.
I might have a different point of view as a former mental health professional. I think a lot of our issues when we claim it's gun problems are the way our society is addressing mental health needs. And I'm not, to clarify, I am not a supporter of red flag laws in any way. But we need to really integrate mental health into physical health because they interrelate like we don't even realize, and truly start to address people's needs, because I find it an odd emotion to decide to shoot somebody without knowing them. And I think that's a disturbed idea, and I think it can be addressed via appropriate mental health attention earlier in life.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg?
The studies have all shown that there is no correlation between mental illness and a mass violent shooting, a mass shooting. What we have, for example, the shooter in El Paso, the place where I graduated high school, was perfectly sane and drove there with the intent to shoot immigrants and Hispanic Americans. Those are not the acts of a mentally ill person. Those are the acts of a person filled with hate. We need to address the mental illness. We do need to have that focus as well, because there are issues that relate to that, primarily suicide with gun death. But the issues that we have are much deeper. It's a sense of a culture. It's almost a casual gun culture where now to carry my gun is the same thing as to carry my wallet, my keys, and my cell phone. That's the kind of thing you have to attack, and it's been very long in coming, and it's going to be very long in addressing. But we have to address that in a way. I think reasonable gun laws, particularly universal background checks, would be a start, but we need so much more.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger?
Yeah, Tatum, thank you. And our hearts are heavy, like I mentioned previously, because this is just such a tragedy that affects the community in a way that we couldn't have predicted. And again, our hearts go out to those families that had to deal with that. I appreciate, Mr. Cody, your work in mental health, and I appreciate the fact that you acknowledge that the country needs to continue to do more. And I think that President Trump has taken steps within the last 2 years to address mental health, to have a task force that assigns itself towards figuring this out. My wife is a counselor. She has been dedicated to helping kids, both in the education system and as a military spouse. But when it comes to the tragedies of gun violence. What we do know is that these criminal acts are done by people who are intent on breaking the law. We don't need to restrict Second Amendment rights in order to solve this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Differing point of view. Could I have 30 seconds to address that?
Give you 30 seconds.
I'll probably take 10. There's such thing as acute mental illness and chronic mental illness. While you may be correct in that studies with chronic mental illness do not reflect on mass homicides, if you're trying to argue that acute mental illness, i.e. a homicidal episode, is committed by a sane and rational human being, I call that a farce.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we want to kind of stay at this point on kind of law enforcement, public safety issues. You hear a lot of talk about defunding the police, okay? A, what does defunding the police mean to you? And B, what are your thoughts on that whole notion? We'll start with Mr. Pfluger.
What a great question. I think it's so pertinent to the landscape today. It's absolutely despicable to see what's going on in Portland, in Chicago, in Seattle, in these cities where there is mass violence happening in the streets that is anarchy, and it's lawlessness. It's everything that this country is not. And when we talk to police officers here in Midland, and I'm proud to be endorsed by multiple organizations of law enforcement and to back them 100%, and you see that Austin, the capital of Texas, has defunded their police to a tune of 30%, the most out of any city in the entire country. And we need police officers here. We're trying to recruit them right here in Midland, Texas. It's, again, despicable to think that the people who are protecting us, keeping our children safe at school, keeping us safe in our homes, that we wouldn't back them. And what a failure in those cities to not back our law enforcement and to give them thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg, your response.
Yes, the defund the police, depending upon your point of view, addresses specifically whether the departments should be, whether the cities should be allowed to and use additional funding to support social services and systems that are a drain on police officers and their law enforcement function. I've represented police officers for over 25 years. I represent police departments, I represent police chiefs, sheriff's departments. I've represented them in all manner of litigation and advice. If there's anyone that supports police officers, it's me. The issue that they're talking about is trying to refocus a department and a city's spending priorities to take away so that the police officer doesn't have to be the social worker, so the police officer doesn't have to be the counselor, so that we can have additional services that address those needs that police officers were never intended to be performing in the first place. And if you look at any jail, you look at any police department, and any officer will tell you that's exactly what they have to do now. It's talking about readjusting priorities.
Thank you. And Mr. Cody, your response.
What is defund the police, and then what would I do about it?
What are your thoughts about it?
What are my thoughts about it?
Or?
Gotcha. So defund, take funds away from police. That's pretty simple. I think it's a really bad idea to remove funds from a chronically underfunded, overworked, underappreciated force that protects my safety. I don't want anyone getting shot at, but I'd rather somebody that's trained to deal with that crisis situation be the one that's dealing with it than somebody shooting through my door just cause. Secondly, you are correct. Police were never designed to address social issues or be mental health providers. But you cannot take funds away from a chronically underfunded sector and give it to another chronically underfunded sector when it's not going to fix their underfunding anyway.
Okay, well, the conversation about defunding the police a lot is rooted majority in race relations. What do you plan to do to help heal the race divide that is growing in our communities? In a time like this, a lot of people look to our elected officials to lead the way, to kind of start that conversation. So what would you do to continue that healing? Mr. Pfluger, we'll start with you.
Yeah, and it's such an important question, and I appreciate just the magnitude of this question. I think this is something that, especially in this district where we have 35% of our demographics that are Hispanic families, that it's very important that we talk about this from the standpoint of what do we want in our values. I think everybody in District 11 wants to work hard. They want to provide for their families. They want to make sure that they're raising their children and able to talk about their faith in God. As somebody who served in the military for 20 years, one thing that I know is that I've served with people from New York all the way to California and everywhere in between. And it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we can find those areas of overlap. And there may not be much overlap with people on the other side of the aisle, but if there's 1%, I'm going to look to find that. And I think that is one of the most important things when it comes to treating people with respect, fighting for what we believe in, but not losing sight of the fact that we're all humans trying to do the best job in the best way we can.
Thank you, Mr. Cody.
All lives matter. And when we discuss, does racism happen, does this, we're discussing the federal government implementing policies or laws that will say this population is more important than this population. That's an injustice. We are all equal. If you are a citizen, we are equal. If you are not treated equally by somebody in power, virtually every organization has a right or has a way in their policy and procedures to rectify that situation. And if you are in public and you are being a racist bleep hole and somebody does not approve of that and you get socked in the mouth, the next time you're going to behave like a child, you will think to yourself, maybe somebody's going to smack me in the mouth.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg?
I think it's does an injustice to this topic for three white men to be up here talking about it. But so be it what it may. This is an issue that is older than our country. Slavery, attacking and the distribution, the dispossession of the Native Americans were here. Race has been with our country since the beginning. The minority communities that I talk with and that I'm with every day, talking and trying to understand, are tired of hearing what white people have to say about race. What they want is for our country to be dedicated to living up to its ideals, that this is true, that this is truly a nation where all men and women are created equal, and that they are treated the same. That's what the issues with the George Floyd protests have been about. We have to address it, and we have to take action. Talking about that we want to talk about it is not enough. They're tired of that. We need action on positive legislative proposals.
So let's branch out to a more national, international level now, and I'll ask a question. Who do you believe is the biggest threat to America's national security? And Mr. Cody, I'll throw it to you first.
Our politicians. Good.
That's good. Okay, then we're going to throw it next to you, Mr. Hogg.
On an international basis, if you're dealing with that, I would say China and Russia are our two greatest threats. When you're dealing just with security threats, I think the FBI summed it up with the greatest threat to our national security at this point is white supremacy and domestic terrorism. That has to be addressed. This administration has done nothing but encourage it. We have to suppress that. We have to suppress white supremacy, and particularly white supremacy in its violent forms, as has been demonstrated by the Proud Boys and by other organizations over the last few years. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Pfluger.
Well, it's such an important question. 60 seconds doesn't cut it here. Unequivocally, China is the biggest threat to the United States and to the world order. And what you see after the post-World War II era, where freedom and democracy and the highest quality and standard of living has been transported across the oceans and continent to continent, that is now being challenged. And as somebody who flew the F-22, the most technologically advanced weapons system and airplane in the world, I know firsthand just how critical it is to protect that technology. What China is doing, stealing our intellectual capital, unfair trade practices, everything that undermines law and order is being challenged right now. And President Trump has stood up to China in a way that no other president has done, and it needs to happen. And we need to take this seriously. We need serious leaders in Washington who understand this problem, who have fought around the world to make sure that we do protect not just our economy, but also our weapon systems and the technology that we have prepared here that has leveraged us into the world power.
Oh, I used like 5 seconds. Can I now rebuttal their points on something?
No, because your name wasn't
Okay.
invoked.
No, that's
so
okay.
You lost that time.
That's perfect. I got it.
We've got much more time coming up, so you'll have your chance, Mr. Cody. Thank you to everyone. We're just getting started. We need to take a short station break. Please stay tuned, and when we come back, we will ask more questions to our 3 candidates.
Okay, 2-minute station break. 2 minutes.
Yeah. At the very beginning, that teleprompter was still coming. Wasn't coming up. So I was trying to add it, but then when it came up, it was like, that's not. I know. Okay, so.
Okay, where do you want to start next?
Okay, so you're going to start right off the bat with the student question from Christian Cook from Greenwood, right? There
Go
you go.
Rangers.
Good looking tie too.
We're a minute 30 out, a minute
Okay,
30.
and
Okay, what else?
I think now we can. I mean, if you want to just, doing the foreign, if we want to start playing around with the climate, and then.
Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome back to our congressional debates. And now we have the opportunity to hear from one of our students from Greenwood High School, Christian Cook. Christian?
Thank you. Do you think there should be a change in the Electoral College vote from how our forefathers designed it?
Thank you, Christian. We'll toss that question first to Mr. Cody.
Nope.
That's it? Okay.
Good.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg?
There are many good arguments for and against. I don't see it as a realistic possibility that the Electoral College is going to go away. I think it's a good system. I think it's served us well. So I would be in favor of keeping the Electoral College in place. There could be some revamping done with some interstate compacts as how we want to deal with the apportionment of electoral votes, but I do think it's something that we need to keep at this point.
Thank you. And Mr. Pfluger?
Pat, thanks for the question. Christian, what a great question coming from a bright young mind, and we appreciate all of the high school students here taking part in this process, offering us your views. And no, I don't think that we should make any changes to the Electoral College. I think the founders of this country, when they wrote the Constitution, anticipated things in a way that is a little bit beyond some of our own comprehension. Some divine inspiration in that document. And I think what they knew was that there would be some states with more population, other states that were more rural. And what we're seeing right now is that is exactly what is happening throughout the country. And we definitely don't need to go change something that offers this republic, this representative form of government, and has done so well for almost 240 years.
Thank you. Before we went to the station break, we asked the question about national security. Who do you think poses the biggest threat? Let's talk about the other side of it. Who or which countries do you believe are America's strongest allies? Mr. Hogg, we'll start with you.
The United Kingdom, without a question. I mean, there's a unique relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. I think in our connections with Western Europe are valuable, and we need to support those completely. So those would be the allies that I see as the biggest allies, the most consistent allies we have. I would like to see us stretch further to increasing relations with India and some other of the South Asian countries. In particular, I think that's where a lot of the growth economically and militarily is going to come. That's also where a lot of the world's problems seem to be right now. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger?
Well, I agree with my opponent on that. The UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, they call it the Five Eyes. For somebody who has a security clearance, it's important to realize that we have fought together, and as somebody who has fought with many different nations in combat, we do need allies around the world. I'd also like to point to Israel, one of the most important allies that we have. And in a Middle East region where we've been at war for many decades, seeing what Israel and the UAE, Israel and Bahrain have done to establish diplomacy, that's the leadership that President Trump has helped guide in a region that we all know is fraught with chaos and fraught with an enemy from Iran that needs to be countered. And it's these partnerships that will help counter it. We have actually done a lot of work in the Indo-Pacific theater to bring India into the discussion. And it's very important that we continue, whether it's Japan and Korea or any of the allies in NATO, to help these alliances and partnerships grow so that we can stabilize not just this country, but the entire world.
Thank you. Mr. Cody?
So when discussing allies or foreign relations, I think it's important to remember some countries don't agree with us. Some countries do. Some countries agree on this issue, but not on this, and vice versa. Excuse me. I'm not a big proponent of us being any long-term ally with no, I don't know. Like, I guess the best way I can reference it is, if my brother's wrong, I might have his back, but I only have his back so far. And just because me and you are on friendly terms as a nation doesn't mean I'm going to let you drag my young men and women into any conflict just because we're allies. So I think all of that should be negotiable. And I would agree with Mr. Pfluger that while I do not believe that it was solely Trump that achieved this, peace in the Middle East is good for the world.
So let's talk about immigration. I think everyone looks at the last number of years and agrees that our immigration system is broken. But yet it seems like time and time again Congress doesn't seem to be able to get its act together and fix it, or at least try to reform it. What legislative policies do you support for immigration reform? We'll start with you, Mr. Pfluger.
Well, thanks for the question. And there's very few districts who this impacts more than it does our own district. But what I'll say to this is that before we can get to the point where we can reform immigration, which we badly need, we have to make sure that the country is secure. And what that means is the funding for our DHS and our Customs and Border Patrol, for ICE, making sure that they have the tools and the resources, that they're trained. And when I mentioned that we're in a way of life fight, this is part of it, because we know that the defunding of these agencies is going to happen. It's been said. And so we need to make sure that when we're protecting our own country against drugs, human trafficking, cartel violence, that we do that first and foremost, and we do it right. And we do it through the brave men and women who are on the southern border every day risking their lives. And then reform will come, and that will lead to more prosperity. And this district can benefit from that. But the first discussion is making sure that we're secure.
Thank you. Mr. Cody.
A nation absolutely has the right to secure its sovereign borders, whether that's goods, people, however. Now, I'm probably a little different in that I don't know if I want a federal government dictating when I can and cannot leave the nation, but that's my opinion. Your question was prefaced with the concept that Congress wants this fixed. I believe Congress does not want it fixed because both Democrats and Republicans get elected consistently off the promise that we'll be the ones to fix it. But if they fix it, there's no longer the need to run on that issue. That's why it's been an issue for 40 or 50 years. They don't want it fixed. It helps them get reelected.
He's generically raised both parties, do either of you choose to take a 30-second rebuttal?
I haven't answered yet.
Okay,
So
we'll go on to you then.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Hogg.
Well, the simple fact is you cannot secure the border unless you fix the immigration issue first. And it is not true that there's any plan to defund DHS or Customs Enforcement or the Border Patrol. In fact, I think the opposite is true. What we're talking about is getting to a security that's more in line with the technology and the resources that we have with boots on the ground. But the issue with immigration, which is the question asked, has to do with there has to be a way, we have to deal with the quota system that we have. We need to get into a system where it is more related to skills sets that can be brought into the country. I think George W. Bush's plan that was proposed back when he was president is a good place to start, and you can go read it on his website, on his Presidential Library's website. We have to fix that. The employers that I run into all across the district are talking about the need to get the agricultural workers. The skilled workers in the oil and gas field are workers that we need to bring in. So.
Okay, now would either of you care for a 30-second rebuttal?
Yes, I think it is untrue that we don't want to fix this issue. Let's talk about Mr. Raymond Mesa, who owns a fence company in San Angelo, who calls me asking, why is the visa system not working properly? So we do want to fix that particular issue so that he, running a small business, can continue to provide for the agricultural needs. The same can be said right here in Midland, Odessa, where there's a number of doctors who are trying to continue to keep well-trained professionals, whether they're nurses, physicians, or any other specialties, right here in the area. But instead, because of a broken system, they're fleeing, they're not able to keep their jobs here.
Mr. Hogg, would you care a 30-second response?
I would agree, and I think it's a fundamental issue with Congress. It is a broken system. Congress is not able to function. Congress is not fulfilling its obligations as a co-equal third branch of government, but as an arena in which political combat is fought. There are fundamental issues, I think, that we must address with Congress, how it functions, the rules under which it operates that I think can improve those things. But the main issue is getting back to an issue of finding common sense solutions to the problems of this country, which is not our focus right now.
Let's keep talking about this. You can't talk about immigration reform without talking about border security, and you can't talk about border security without talking about immigration reform. Congress the last 4 years have not been able to come up with a solution, reach across the aisle, and find an answer. If elected, what would you do to reach across the aisle and finally find an answer to these two-pronged issues in our country? We'll start with Mr. Cody.
Well, I guess if I was elected, I would be the only libertarian. I would have no aisle, so I couldn't reach across. But realistically, I'm no expert on defense, nor am I an expert on border security. I would literally listen to the experts, and then right there you saw a Democrat and a Libertarian have a conversation, and we agreed on some things and disagreed on others. You focus on what we agreed on, and you build from that point forward. You do not focus on what we disagreed on and then go opposite directions.
Mr. Hogg?
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
Well, if elected, what would you do to reach across the aisle? Yeah, try to find a solution.
It's all about building relationships. It is about building those relationships from the moment you enter Congress. And it's not just building relationships with those in the majority party and the Democratic Party. It's about building relationships with your Republican colleagues, the freshman Republican colleagues, and those senior. It's about understanding each other, understanding where they come from, understanding their background and why they see issues the way they see it. At that point, you can actually begin to have a conversation about, I understand why you see us that way. I disagree with you, but now we can talk about, let's figure out a way that we can address all our issues and come to an agreement. It's a long-term process. It is not a short-term. You can't just say, I'm going to go in and reach across the aisle. You're talking about years and years of work and knowing individuals.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger?
Well, I appreciate the levity and a brief moment of humor in a debate here, and the collegiality as well. But, I've mentioned this before in my answers that this is something that I think my military background really suits me well for this job. However, I will say that there might be issues where we don't agree on. And when it comes to an unsecure border and the ability for folks to come freely across our southern border specifically, that would do us harm. And I think we saw this in January of this year, where there was a Yemeni who brought in and was accused, convicted of bringing in dozens of folks who did not want anything other than to do us harm. And so there are some issues that we need to reach across the aisle, and we need to understand those issues. And then there's the other ones that are red lines. And when it comes to the security of this country, that really is a red line for me.
Thank you.
Now we'd like to welcome another one of our students and who has a question for our candidates. We'd like to welcome Miss Serena Gonzalez from Midland High School.
Hello, thank you. Okay, my question is, what specific plans do you have to include young people's input when planning and voting for our district?
Thank you, Serena. We'll start with you, Mr. Hogg.
I think that the key there is building that, again, it's about building those relationships long term. The keys is reaching down into the high schools and in the colleges and understanding the colleges, visiting the colleges, and being able to interrelate with the students in that setting. And there's also with the trade schools and the entire generation. It is a generational thing of how you communicate. Technology is a great resource, but there's nothing like the actual interactions with the students on a consistent and continuous basis. The intern program is a good example of that in the houses of Congress. That's something that needs to be continued. But a lot of it really is going to have to be spending time in the district, spending as much time as possible in the district where you can maintain that connection with the student groups and the organizations that you meet and that you work with on a regular basis. Involving youth in programs through your local offices will be crucial. So I look forward to that.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger.
Serena, what a great question, and I think it's something that's so important. Just today I spoke with Dr. Woodley, president of University of Texas Permian Basin, and throughout this whole campaign process we have visited every single university and college in this district. It's something that's important to understand what's on the minds of our young folks. Just on Friday was at Howard Payne listening to a political science class and talking about the important issues, and I think that my opponent is right. It's important to continue the intern program, to have a council of advisors who are from the younger demographic that have something to offer. And we, I think, as citizens and leaders, need to continue to train up that next generation of leaders. And like I mentioned, my daughters are right here in the studio tonight. We're making sure that they see this political process, that they take part in it, and that they know what's going on and that they know their voice is going to be heard. So I encourage everyone who is young, that even if this is the first time that you can vote, starting tomorrow, please go exercise that right.
Thank you. And Mr. Cody, your response.
So to directly answer your question, my goal is to utilize my, House website to categorize and record every contact that my staff reaches. I mean, every contact that reaches me, myself and my staff, whether it's email, phone call, or letter, whether that's a tweet, however you want to quantify it, it will all be public knowledge. Also, other than address or names, that will also be public knowledge, and then that information will be reflected in my voting record. And if my voting record does not reflect those contacts, because I represent young people, old people, all people of this district, then I'm not doing a good job and I should not be reelected.
Okay, thank you. Here's an interesting question, caught my attention. What committee in the House of Representatives would you like to serve on and why? Mr. Pfluger?
Well, there's several committees that I think would do this area, this district justice. And we can start with committees that would influence the oil and gas industry, of which there's 5 or 6. So it's those relationships that we've already talked about today that would help me serve those. Agriculture, armed services, energy and commerce, those are 3 specific ones that I think would be very important to this area to make sure that we take the challenges seriously, that we advocate for what this district needs, that we continue to strengthen not only our economy but our security. And when it comes to serving on a committee, one of the pieces of advice that I've been handed by multiple people, and not just about committee assignments, but about your vote, is to make sure that you don't have just one vote, that you can influence multiple different people to get what we need to have our conservative opinion heard so that we can do exactly what needs to be done in District 11. And that's what I've been doing throughout this campaign process and what I will do as your congressman.
Thank you. Mr. Cody?
Did you just say you want to use your position to influence other congressmen? Is that, I mean, that's what I heard. I guess the agricultural committee would fit me. I like to say I passed the Jesse James test. You could feel the calluses on my hands from digging post holes when you can't afford gloves, driving T-post and building fence. Realistically, both parties are going to bury me where I never get seen. So that's pretty much that.
Okay, Mr. Hogg?
I think energy is crucial, just because it not only has an impact for Permian Basin, but for the state as a whole and the country and the world. So I think that's obviously where the focus needs to be. Agriculture would be a close second because of the variety and the depth and the impact of the agriculture industry, and beyond farmers and ranchers into production and other things. I think it impacts us. Because Goodfellow Air Force Base is in San Angelo, Texas, and is in the district, I think armed services is key. We've come close to losing that base in the past, and I've been a part of efforts to maintain that as well during my time on city council and in local government. And so I think it's crucial that we have someone on armed services that can look out for that interest for our district as well.
Yeah, and just a response on
30
Sure,
seconds.
yes, 30 seconds.
Yes. If we're not up there educating folks on what the oil and gas industry does, what agriculture does for this district, the state of Texas, and the country, then I think we're missing an opportunity. And when it comes to small little things like predator control, we need to be the ones that are taking our experience in the ranching business to let people know that this is important. And there's legislation that affects our ranchers and our farmers and obviously the energy industry. And we need to be the voice to represent this district and advocate for this district.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out a question now that one of our viewers sent in, and it goes as follows. It is generally believed that the COVID-19 pandemic has become a political issue, so much so that there are many out there saying that it'll be over after November 3rd. Meanwhile, over 215,000 Americans have died since the pandemic began. What measures do you believe should be taken so we can reduce the number of deaths? And then as a quick follow-up, do you believe a national lockdown would be beneficial if the rate continues? We'll start with Mr. Cody.
Do I believe it's a political issue, and then do I believe in a national lockdown?
Well, what do you, what measures would you take so that we can reduce the number of deaths?
What measure? Okay. I think it's pretty simple. You utilize the ADA to protect any at-risk population that scientists agree that this disease is a high risk for. And by saying that, I mean you allow for them to work at home if it is not an undue burden on their employer. And then the second part of that question, is a nationwide lockdown a good thing? Abso-freaking-lutely not. It's a terrible idea. Let every aspect for vaccines, for biological understanding the last 100 years supports herd immunity. Let the healthy get the disease. Some will die, but you cannot eradicate our entire economy.
Time. Thank you. Mr. Hogg, your response.
I'm afraid that it absolutely has become a political issue, and it has become a political issue with whether you should wear a mask or not, or take social distancing guidelines. And I think the leadership at our national level has wasted a golden opportunity, even after it became apparent what the depth of this pandemic was going to be, still refusing to lead the country. What we need to address COVID-19, which I think is essential for get our economy back going, is we have to have a national testing strategy. We have to have a national contact tracing strategy that works with the states to make sure we can identify the folks that have been infected and that need to be quarantined. We have to have issues related to providing PPE and funding the resources appropriately so that people can get back to work with the proper level of protective equipment that they have, and also be provided with paid time off to care for those that are sick or if they have the quarantine. We have to have a national strategy that goes that way, working in conjunction with our states.
Time. Mr. Pfluger.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I think the last thing we need is more national mandates to tell us how to do business in Midland, Odessa, San Angelo, because what we have here is much different than what we're seeing in New York City and other places like that. The president in January stopped flights. He took the unprecedented action to stop flights from China and took the steps to make sure that he immediately started saving lives. And do you know what? It is politicized. It's been terribly politicized. In March, there was a Democrat primary. You know how many questions were asked about COVID? 0. That was in March. And yet they would criticize his actions to stop those flights to keep people safe. And I think that we know that we definitely do not need a lockdown that is mandated from Washington, D.C. when the economy is hurting, when small businesses are hurting, when the oil and gas industry has suffered mightily because of the actions that are of no fault of our own to keep people safe, but we need this economy to keep going, and we need local control, local decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we have the opportunity to take another question from one of our students.
Could I have a moment to respond to that, since he
Please,
addressed my position on it? And I did not address the issue of the national lockdown. I'm opposed to national lockdowns. Those decisions to be made with the state, and I did not say national control over these issues. What you have to have is you have to recognize, which the president has failed time and time and time again to recognize, that this is a national and international pandemic, the likes of which we have not seen in this country or in the world for over 100 years. You have to address that, and the fact that we can sit here and talk about what the president has done nothing.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to our student question from Suzette Trujillo from Permian High School.
How do you plan to support and invest the local art projects?
Okay, we will start with Mr. Hogg.
Sure. The arts are a crucial part of our society and of our culture. They make us richer. The idea that we would defund those, I think we need to be focusing instead on investing appropriately through the National Endowment for the Arts, through other grants organizations, through the Kennedy Center, and all across the country. I've been involved in theater and other art projects in my community for years. That they are so enriching, and we have to focus on that, and the idea that you would defund the federal funds that go to help support those organizations to keep those up. Anyone who's been in the arts will tell you there's no money in the arts. If you want to bring it down to a dollar figure, you would not have any arts whatsoever because the money is not there. What we're talking about is increasing the human spirit and increasing the drive and the desire and the creativity of our people, and it is so crucial to our national consciousness that we continue to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger?
Suzette, thanks for the question, and it is an important aspect. I think it's something that's done best by the private citizens, by folks who in that free enterprise decision that they make, that's something that the communities are doing in Midland, Odessa, San Angelo, Granbury, everywhere in this district. You see so many different things that are happening at that local level. What I wouldn't advocate for is what Nancy Pelosi has done, trying to sneak in millions of dollars into our COVID CARES Act to recover our economy when she's trying to put that into the Kennedy Center. And so I appreciate the arts. I hope that we can continue at that private local level to continue a strong program for the arts, but that's not something that federal funding needs to go towards when our economy and our communities are hurting.
Mr. Cody?
I guess the phrase beauty's in the eye of the beholder fits. If it's artistic and you produce a good and I like it, I will purchase it. I guess maybe there's no money in the arts because you don't know of a good artist. I know of a lot of Western artists that, Remington, for example, those, while he's not alive, those artworks and sculptures and painting go for thousands and thousands of dollars. If you are a donor, you can then take that money and use it as you see fit, similar to what Mr. Pfluger said, a private enterprise. If your question was more specifically about how art programs are being cut in public schools, I do not believe federal funds should be going to public school education.
Okay, thank you.
Here's another reader question. centering on the coronavirus. In a recent Fox News poll, over half of Americans disapprove of the way the president has handled the coronavirus response. What is your opinion of how the president and the federal government's response to the virus? We'll start with Mr. Pfluger.
Well, I think it's important to note that my colleague here has adamantly said that the president has failed to keep this country safe. And yes, there are those who disagree with the way that he has handled this, but it's easy to be an armchair quarterback. And the fact is that not even one death is okay. But when it comes to the way that Joe Biden and President Obama handled the swine flu, 60 million Americans contracted the swine flu. Now, if that had been coronavirus, the death toll would have easily been close to 2 million or maybe even in excess of 2 million. So the steps that have been taken to make sure that we are safe, but now where local and state governments can get back to work at the pace according to the environment that the communities are in, I think that the heart of this issue is to make sure that we don't have national mandates, that we let state and local governments decide what is best for each community, and we keep the federal government at bay without having overreach.
Thank you. Mr. Cody, your response.
My opinion on how Trump has dealt with the coronavirus pandemic. I do not believe it was ever in his jurisdiction to do anything about it. Realistically, I don't even think it's a state issue. Governor Abbott literally has said, if you work in blank industry, you are not an essential person. Your job doesn't matter. If you work in this industry, you do matter. I still carry the letter in my wallet that says I can go to work, just in case Governor Abbott creates some other mandate that shuts something down. If you do not want people that have or potentially can spread coronavirus, and you believe social distancing and wearing a mask benefits your well-being and you own a business, implement those strategies in your business. If you don't want to implement those strategies, don't implement them.
Thank you. Mr. Hogg.
Sure. My opponent likes to talk about the swine flu, but you notice he didn't give you the statistic on how many people had died. They're closing in on 220,000 deaths in the United States of America. I think the Trump administration's approach to this has been lackadaisical, it has been tardy, it has been to ignore it and to deny it. Even when, as we've all now seen, when he knew exactly what the nature of the pandemic was, what it could turn into, he still didn't want to keep that from the American people. He not only didn't want to keep it from the American people, he wanted to keep it from Congress, he wanted to keep it from our elected representatives who are in charge of national policies and representing their districts. It's been an absolute disaster. Just think of what could have happened if the president who had the information had responded in an appropriate and a timely manner. How many lives would have been saved? That's all I can say about that.
Okay, you mentioned Mr. Pfluger, so you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Well, I think lackadaisical is the opposite word. This is a man of action. The president is a businessman. Shutting down the greatest economy in the history of the world had to be one of the toughest decisions, knowing that it would affect every American in this country. So lackadaisical is exactly opposite of his approach. He's a man of action. He's led from the front. He was criticized early on for his actions, and he continues to be criticized. And yes, those numbers are startling, but what he has done is ensure that we can safely recover the economy and get back to work.
Thank you.
And while we are talking about the coronavirus pandemic, the race is on to get us a vaccine, but when polled, more than half of all Americans have indicated that they would not take a vaccine when one becomes available. So do you believe a vaccine should be mandated? Mr. Cody?
No. I don't believe any vaccine should be mandated. But if my child has been vaccinated from whooping cough, but yours is not old enough to be vaccinated from whooping cough, and you choose not to vaccinate, we don't have to let our child be exposed to your child. Does that make sense? I don't believe government should be dictating policy to any citizen when it comes to the control of his or her body, period. I do think it is idiotic with the risks of not vaccinating your children to put them in an era of pre-1950s healthcare.
Mr. Hogg?
At the outset, I would say I would oppose any vaccine mandate, at least at the outset, and depending upon how the pandemic proceeds. I think what we're talking about is not an anti-vaxxer mentality, but we're talking about distrust that has been created by the administration in science and in the medical, and the certainty that the vaccine is going to be appropriate, that it's going to be good, that it doesn't have any disastrous side effects. The administration has denigrated science all through this and ignored science and ignored the scientists, ignored Dr. Fauci, ignored Dr. Birx, and ignored so many advisors at the CDC and the medical community about what needs to happen. All you have to do is Google it. You can go online and see all the stories. I think that's what we're sensing in the country, is a distrust that the vaccine is being made in the best interest of the people, or is it being made in the best interest of re-electing the President of the United States?
Mr. Pfluger?
Tatum, thanks for the question. And I think what we're seeing here is Operation Warp Speed is an example, one of the shining examples of a public-private partnership that leads to success in a rapid fashion. It really embodies the American spirit, working together, coming up with a solution. And with science, the president is using the smartest minds in the entire world in some of the best companies to come up with something in a time frame that has never been achieved. Now, I don't support a mandatory vaccine, and I think that this is something that we're going to see how it goes. But I do support those who need it the most getting it and having access to it, whether that's the elderly or folks that have existing conditions that need to be taken care of. And so I appreciate the president's leadership on this. What he has done in the face of adversity is nothing short of a miracle.
So what is your opinion of the process that they're going through right now of confirming a Supreme Court justice just 22 days before the election? We'll start with you, Mr. Hogg.
Okay. I think it's an issue of fair play, and I think that's what the American public recognizes. I do not know Judge Barrett. I have never met her. I haven't looked at her qualifications, although the ABA did not unanimously recommend her as qualified for a seat on the Supreme Court. I think what we have here is a classic case of let's use raw power to accomplish our objectives when we're not sure what the outcome of the election will be. If the opportunity were on the other foot, I would like to think that the Democratic Party would not be rushing this through in that example. The Senate has turned into a partisan raw power body. It is no longer the deliberative body which is the wisdom of the country. We need to get back to whatever system we use and however we do this in the future, but we need to have a system of fair play where the rules do not change based upon who is in the majority of how that process will be taking place. And I think that's what the American people expect.
Thank you. Mr. Pfluger.
Well, first off, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the last 3 months of a president's 4-year term don't count, that he doesn't have the opportunity, he or she have the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice. In fact, in our history, 29 Supreme Court justices or would-be justices have been nominated in an election year. So I think it's critically important that we follow through, and especially at this moment in time. And when you look at the way that the Democrats have treated Amy Coney Barrett, have just, in the first confirmation hearing for her current position, have attacked her religious beliefs, said that she's going to, use those in a way that is not judicial. It's unwholly true. And this is a mother of 7 children, a devoted Catholic, somebody who cares very deeply about this country and knows the Constitution, will exercise her duties with the full intention to make sure that she upholds the Constitution.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cody, your remarks.
I think it's a shining example of how politicians politicize any and every issue they can. As Mr. Hogg pointed out, when the shoe was on the other foot, Republicans cried, "Oh, this is terrible. Obama's trying to appoint somebody in an election year." Now Republicans say, "Oh, he's supposed to be able to appoint somebody. You can't avoid an election 4 years ago, 3 months into 3 months left with their presidency." The real answer is the United States citizens elected Donald Trump. He gets to serve for 4 years. Per the Constitution, he gets to nominate Supreme Court justices throughout that tenure as president. The Senate independently of the executive branch, not making back alley deals with the president, represents the states that elected those individuals. And those individuals then confirmed the Supreme Court justice. It is not some wheeling and dealing back alley sideshow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes our question and answer segment. It's time for our closing remarks from each of our candidates. I want to remind y'all you've got 1 minute each for this. We'll start with you, Mr. Cody.
Okay. It's pretty humbling to think that I am running for United States Congress. It's I guess it's a situation I don't hold lightly. I ask for you, when evaluating this debate and anything any of us write or say, to truly objectively look at who best represents the men and women that make up this district, and not just those that have the money or the political power in this district. Secondly, I believe all people, regardless of their political affiliation, probably share 80% of life choices. We want the best for our kids, we want the best for our friends, we want the best for our families. And I believe that you are all the best advocates for your children, your friends, your families, and yourselves, not the federal government.
Mr. Hogg.
Thank you. We've made a grave mistake in our politics for many years. That is, we have begun to believe the lie that what Washington politicians and pundits and parties tell us is important and that we should think is important and that we should be talking about actually is important. I think our representation has gone too far in addressing the issues of national politics and has not spent enough time focusing on the issues here in our district, but instead has been part of spreading the fear and hatred that has continued to divide us. That is what I'm running against. It is the idea that we cannot work together to solve our problems, that we cannot represent the common folk of this district and address the real problems, which we haven't talked about here tonight, such as health care, rural health care, public education, those sorts of issues. Those are the things that we need to be talking about, and those are the things that I would like to represent you in Congress about. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pfluger.
Tatum, Pat, and Basin PBS, thank you for the opportunity to be here. To my opponents, thanks for the time in this process, a very important process. And to the folks in District 11, there has never been a more important time in our country's history to go to the polls starting tomorrow. This is a way of life decision. I'm running for your values. I am running for everything that we hold dear, including our oil and gas industry, agriculture, helping our military and our veterans, continuing to strengthen an economy that has been unprecedented and has unlimited potential. We are facing a way of life decision on November 3rd. In just 21 short days, we will go to the polls to cast our vote for a way of life. And I have confidence that in District 11, we will go to the polls to make sure that we can continue to raise our families in a conservative mindset that allows each and every individual in this district to reach their full potential. My name is August Pfluger, and I would be honored to have your vote.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. You know, it's been a very long time since West Texas District 11 has seen a new face, and so we hope that you all know that we appreciate your time and know just how important tonight was and giving our viewers, our readers, a chance to get to know each of you and the platforms that you stand for. You know, every single question that we asked tonight came from one of our viewers, one of our readers, and things that are very important to them. So we appreciate your time and efforts, and giving us the opportunity to get to know you. Now, for all of you at home, you know, tomorrow it's the very beginning, the first day of early voting, and that will extend through October 30th. So between now and the next 2 weeks is your opportunity to get out and vote. Now, it's going to look very different this year. I know we've said that many times. I almost sound like a broken record at this point. So before you head out to the polls, go online and do the research on where your polling locations are going to be. Those are different this year. In Midland and Odessa, there are 5 early voting locations. So be sure to go online, check those out. You don't want to show up to a place that is not having early voting. And again, the most important date that we need to know is Election Day. That is Tuesday, November 3rd. So we hope you go out and exercise your right to vote. And with that, we conclude tonight's debate. We hope that you have found it informative, and we encourage all of our viewers to vote for the candidate of your choice. Do your research. If you have liked our coverage of local elections over the last month, we hope that you will consider becoming a member of Basin PBS. Simply go to basinpbs.org for membership levels as low as $60 a year. Programs such as tonight's debate would not be possible without our local support. I'm Tatum Gwynn in the Anwar Family Studios of Basin PBS, my co-moderator, the lead moderator, Mr. Pat Canty, and of course, us here at NewsWest 9. Thank you so much for tuning in, and good night.
We're clear.
Gentlemen.